When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing clinical social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 22. Even adversity could not hold him back. He chose to be the controller of his narrative. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our remarkably daring guest, Asante Houghton. Asante is a mental health advocate devoted to changing the world. He is focused on amplifying the stories of everyday people to illuminate gaps in the system while working to build bridges between community members and policymakers in order to find solutions to challenges together. Asante is the co-founder of the Reach Out Response Network, an organization advocating for non-police-led mobile crisis emergency response. Asante is also a 2 times TEDx speaker and a Center for Addiction and Mental Health difference maker, awarded with the distinction of being one of the top 150 mental health influencers in Canada. When Asante is not speaking and advocating, he is designing, managing, and facilitating peer support training programs at Stella's Place, which is a youth mental health service agency in Toronto, and hosting the web show Cypher, which turns peer support stories into original songs by Juno-nominated musicians. Young at heart, silly, self-deprecating, and able to find a sports analogy for virtually anything. Asante tries not to take himself too seriously despite being engaged in the serious work of change making. Hello, Asante. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. I love the way you read that intro. That was very like I was into it. I was enthralled.
That is all you. This is all your work. This is everything you've been doing. And first of all, I just want to say that your work is admirable and humbling. And it's such a pleasure to have you on the show today. And I'm so thankful that you're showing up with willingness to share your own personal story with all of our listeners. I also want to say that you're being here today to help support this initiative and for taking a stance to help break barriers of mental stigma. This is so heartfelt for me. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. I think stories are everything. So any
Mm-hmm.
opportunity that I have to tell a story or to hear someone else's story or hear a story, um, I take it because I think that's where real connection is made.
Yeah, there's so
So
much power in storytelling.
definitely 100%. For me, I look at stories as art,
Mm-hmm.
and when we think about art, what makes it really connect with us is that art speaks a language that is unspoken, if that makes sense.
It's like
Um,
abstract.
right? And it's very visceral. It's like
Mm-hmm.
you shouldn't need to explain it. You either get it or you don't.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I see stories connecting people in the same way that you can look at a painting or hear a song or see a dance and know exactly how the artist was feeling in the moment of creation.
That's part of what this podcast is really all about. It's bringing forward untold stories that people go through, whether it's directly about a mental health struggle or something else. And no matter what a person's story is, what I have learned over the years is that there is impact to an individual's mental health in some way, and usually remaining tucked away. So that's why I'm so forward about the intention for this platform and using this as a platform to break those barriers of mental stigma. I feel like there's been so much that's been conditioned in our society. So it's been learned. So let's unlearn it, right? And so our presence together, Asante, yours and mine, I hope it's really to encourage people to share and to tell what they, might typically shy away from expressing. So I'm bringing forward this trend. It's called the mental beauty rethink.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love
What are
it.
your thoughts?
When I hear that, what it says to me is that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, when we talk about mental health, we usually people say mental health to mean mental illness,
Mm-hmm.
right? When someone says,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, I have mental health," what they mean is like I'm not doing well, like I have mental illness,
Right.
right? So for me, it's like, why do we have to think about this from a position of deficit? And why aren't we thinking about this from a position of, I'm not sure the word, but the opposite of deficit, right? So, and to frame it that way, to look at it as a positive thing and a thing that we can embrace and, something beautiful rather than something that we're always trying to fix.
Right.
And I feel, you know, what I do in my professional life is we talk about taking a strength based approach to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And when that was first introduced to me and I started treating myself that way,
Mm-hmm.
I saw the power of it immediately. Like
Mm-hmm.
literally within 3 weeks, I went from being like a person who struggled in pretty much every kind of relationship
Mm-hmm.
to being a person where my relationships were now super strong and I just felt a level of connection with the
Mm-hmm.
people around me that I hadn't before.
It's really eye opening when you start paying attention to these finer pieces and how it's all related back to mental well being.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we don't think about that enough
Mm-hmm.
as people and as a society. I feel like oftentimes we're just kind of on autopilot,
Mm-hmm.
and when things aren't working, we just kind of say, well, it's someone else's fault, it's the world's fault, the government, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we're always
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
blaming. And
Right.
many times all we got to do is look inside or look in the mirror and realize the power that we have over large parts of our own destiny. It's not to say everything is under our control, but
Mm-hmm.
um, many things that we don't necessarily see as under our control, they really
Mm-hmm.
are.
Yeah. Everything we need is within us.
I love that. Say it again.
Everything we need is within us.
Definitely. I believe that so much.
I like that you've been so connected and paying attention to this process. I love it.
Well, it didn't start out that way, like
I know. I
it was
know.
it was a journey, it was a struggle, but it led me here.
It led you here. And so this is where I ask you if you're ready for a deep and raw conversation with me.
Well, yeah, let's get into it. I'm definitely
I'm
ready.
very eager to uncover your journey.
Let's uncover it all.
Let's uncover it all. Okay. So let's start with that very first question. Asante, give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story.
If I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and
Mm-hmm.
what came to my mind was from prodigy to late bloomer.
Can you tell me more about this interesting title? It's very thought provoking.
Yeah, I certainly can, and I think it's a summation of my life in a lot of ways, in the sense that when I was a kid, I was identified very early as someone who had a lot of potential in a lot of different fields or modalities or however you want to call them.
Mm-hmm.
I was probably the best student in my school from kindergarten to grade six. But yeah, this was happening all the time, whether it was like my family, friends, school, my friends, parents. All I was hearing all the time was how much potential I had, and how I was going to change the world, and
Mm-hmm.
how smart I was. And kids used to say, "Oh, you're going to be a scientist at NASA one day," and
Oh, wow.
yeah, it's like,
Right.
wow,
That's a
it's
so I
like,
guess that's where the prodigy part of your title is referring to.
yeah, well, and all that stuff, it didn't work out that way. So
Mm-hmm.
the late bloomer part is, I experienced a lot of challenges, starting in, maybe around grade 7 or 8,
Mm-hmm.
leading all the way until my young adulthood, my early 20s. And, these challenges set me back behind
Mm-hmm.
everybody. So I started
Mm-hmm.
out way ahead of everybody. And by the
Right.
time I hit 20, 21, 22, I was behind everybody that I knew.
It's so interesting that as human beings, we forget that life is not linear. And we need reminders that life is not linear, that it is going to be unpredictable. There will be curveballs, there will be disappointments and triumphs. And that what we expect in our teens or our 20s or 30s or 40s or whatever age might actually turn out different.
Yeah, and it's like everything turned out different than I thought it would. When I was a kid, because of everyone just feeding this idea that I was gonna
Mm-hmm.
be the next like Einstein or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
nobody was trying to support me in nurturing other parts of myself, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden I was behind the ball. Someone asked me when I was like 9 or 10, they're like, "What are you gonna do with your life when you grow up?" I'm like,
Oh
"I'm
gosh.
going to go to the University of Toronto on a scholarship, and then I'm going to blah blah blah." Like, had it
Wow.
laid
Was
out,
so clear.
right? Um, didn't work out that way. I wanted to graduate high school when I was 15 or 16. I ended up graduating, and when I was 19. I figured I'd be done university by the time I was 20 or 21. I was done
Mm-hmm.
university when I was almost 25. So the things I expected didn't come to pass. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
become the software engineer that I wanted to be when I was a kid. I ended up being someone working in social services and community work.
Well, that explains prodigy to late bloomer. Let's go right into the untold story. Tell me more.
Well, the prodigy stuff was certainly a huge part of my life up until around grade 6 ish.
Okay.
And that's where things really started to slowly change, and then later on quickly change. My parents split when I was about 5 years old,
Okay.
and they got divorced. Uh, I was living with my mom with my two older brothers, and my dad was living his life. And at first, we would see each other every weekend, every other weekend. It was pretty frequent.
Hmm.
And then just as the years went by, every week went to every other week, and then every other week became every month, and then every month became every 2 months. And then by the time I got to grade 6, I didn't see my father for the entirety of that school year, that calendar year.
Wow.
And then looking at my mom, she was struggling as an immigrant woman. We're from Jamaica, and
Mm-hmm.
she was an adult when she came. I was a kid, and it's hard to adjust when you're an adult. And she doesn't have like a lot of education, so she was trying to get educated here in Canada. So
Right.
she got herself into university, so she was doing that full time. But she also had to
Right.
feed the kids, so she was working full time,
Mm-hmm.
and she also had a side gig as well,
Mm-hmm.
that required her to be in an office a lot of the time. So she was sleeping in the office from Monday to Friday. And so I was only really seeing her on Saturday, Sunday for pretty much the entirety of that grade 6 year.
Wow.
So my parents basically just like weren't there.
So were you like home alone like
Yeah,
most of that time?
like
Like
I
just
was,
literally the only human being at home?
yeah, all the time, all the time.
Wow.
I was taking care of myself. I was washing dishes. I was making rudimentary meals. I'd come home from school and nobody was home, and then nobody would get home until 7 or 8 o'clock. That's when my brothers would come home, and then
Mm-hmm.
my mom would call just to make sure that we're all okay and the house isn't burning down, and
Right.
and that was kind of it, right?
That must have felt so lonely.
It was tough. It did feel
Yeah.
lonely at times. It
Mm-hmm.
was, at first it was like, yeah, I got the house to myself. I could watch all the
Right.
cartoons I want and eat cereal, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah. Break all the rules. Nobody would know.
right, and
Right.
then
Get to live my life. But
right, and then after 2 weeks, like all of that just wears off, and you're
right.
just like,
Or like,
damn,
this is not fun anymore.
right? Like,
Hmm.
who's gonna reach up to the cupboard to get me that thing? Because I'm a kid, like I'm short, you know.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
it was hard, and at the time, when you're young, you could feel the energy of people, but you can't really articulate it. And
Yes.
I could feel
So you could
that,
sense it. You were sensing it.
yeah, definitely, and I
Mm.
could also sense that people were concerned, but no one ever said anything out loud.
And how did that make you feel? Knowing you had this inner knowing, this sense of what was coming up for you, noticing that people were concerned, you knew that people were noticing this is not okay and nothing was being done differently.
It
What
was
was that like?
isolating.
Yeah.
It felt like I had a secret that I couldn't tell, but everybody knew I had a secret. And this is why I was a late bloomer, because like all of
Right.
like my emotional world was so turbulent. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
really have an opportunity to like I think develop my emotional world in the way that most people who have like healthier, more stable upbringings
Right.
than I did have. Right? It's not to say my
Sure.
upbringing was bad. Like my mom, she's amazing. Don't get me wrong. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
She just had to do what she had to do.
She needed to do what she had to do. It still took a toll on you.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. But yeah, it was super hard, and as the year went by, I started to withdraw more and more, and I remember being in grade 6 and my teacher coming to me one day and
Mm-hmm.
saying, "Hey, is everything okay?" And
Mm.
I didn't know how to respond to that. I just felt ashamed that she
Mm-hmm.
saw something was wrong,
Right.
because I grew up in a culture that said you don't tell anybody your business. What happens in this
Yeah.
house stays in this house. So
Yeah.
I felt
Right.
ashamed that someone noticed that something was happening. But I
Right.
still told her, "No, I'm good. Like everything's okay."
Everything is fine.
It's like you see these opportunities to say, "Hey, something's wrong,"
Yeah.
but you don't take them because you don't know how people are going to respond. Um,
There's a lot of fear, right? And you were so young, and if you were always told that there's consequences for speaking and that no one needs to know what's going on here, the last thing you want to do as a kid who's already feeling alone and no one's around is to say anything more that could make you feel like you might be in more trouble.
and that's it. And it was also like, I was still getting good grades and I was still excelling on the sports teams and I was still
Right.
like a school prefect. I was still like doing
Right.
all the things right. So
Yeah.
it's like, just leave me be. I'm doing all the things you expect of me.
Yes.
So let's leave all the other stuff alone.
Right.
And even my friends actually, some of them started to notice too. They're like, "Hey, how come you don't want to hang out anymore?"
Mm.
And it wasn't like they felt like I didn't like them. It was just like they noticed that I went from being this guy who, like I was saying before, like I was just never in my house and I was involved in everything all the time,
Mm-hmm.
to being, "Hey, Asante, let's go chill after school. Let's go here. Let's go there." And I was like, "No, I'm good. I'm all right. I'm good."
Yeah.
So I started to withdraw a lot. Then I got to grade 7. And again, because I was such a smart kid, it was a thing where I got essentially like shipped off to a different school district. I was still living where I was living, but I was hopping on a bus every day for half an hour, 40 minutes to go to a school that was essentially an all white school and mostly rich, well-to-do kids. It was the kind of place where it wasn't uncommon to see like parents pull up in a Porsche or like a
Right.
Ferrari to pick up their
Right.
kids from school. And my mom didn't even have a car at that point in time, and we're living in the
Right.
projects, right?
Right.
So we're poor. I'm this black kid. They're white. They're rich. So there's already like embedded difference there.
Yeah. You must have felt so displaced and not knowing. You were probably trying to figure out where's the playbook for this, like the rule book for this. How do I manage this environment?
100%. And
Yeah.
no matter what I did, I couldn't figure it out, and it wasn't necessarily because I couldn't figure it out. It was just the differences in our lives and lifestyles because of
Mm-hmm.
race and affluence and all of those things. They showed
Mm-hmm.
up. It's,
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible for those things not to show up,
Right.
right? They just lived a different life than I lived, and the school culture was very much one that embedded these values of how do I say this? It didn't represent anything that I could connect to. And naturally, because most of the students came from a different place, so it made sense for that school to cater to where those students were coming from. Of course, that doesn't absolve them of not being able to properly accommodate students who are different,
Mm-hmm.
like myself, but it makes sense why it was that way. But it was really tough, and what started to happen was my grades started to slip.
Mm,
Um, Real bad. I went from
right.
like pretty much getting 100% on virtually everything
Mm-hmm.
to now I'm getting 60s.
Right. So in high school, everything started to change with your ability to achieve, or just what was happening with the academics.
Yeah, I would say more so in middle school than anything. High school, I was able to bounce back a bit.
Okay.
But the emotional impact of everything was
Okay,
a
so you
lot
had
because
middle school. So you had middle school.
yeah.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
um, so 7 and 8, then I went to high school in grade
Got
9.
it.
Um,
Okay.
so anyway, school was not a fun place to be because
Mm.
I was a fish out of water. My mom was still working all the time. I barely saw her. She was getting more and more stressed and she was withdrawing. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
when you're a kid, you don't know that's what's happening, but
Right.
you feel it. My father wasn't in my life basically at that point. I
Mm-hmm.
should tell you the story of um, I remember being around that age, and like I said, I hadn't seen my father for literally about a year.
Right.
And I remember him calling me on the phone,
Mm-hmm.
and we're just talking, chit chatting, for like 15 minutes or whatnot. And then I paused and I said to him, "Why don't you love me?" And then he went silent on the phone. And then I just started like bawling, like crying, like the hardest cry I'd ever cried.
Wow.
And I don't even remember how that conversation ended. Uh, all I know is just there was a piece of me that kind of broke at that
Yeah.
point, and
You
I
don't
never.
remember anything your father said to you.
No, he didn't
Yeah.
respond at all.
Right.
Like I remember that he did not respond. Like that was
Okay.
clear
That
to me.
that part was that you remember that clearly.
Yeah, and then grade 8 came around, and my mom again was just less and less present emotionally. And then it came out. One day it was during the summer. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
my mom, she comes home and she's crying, which I literally in my life up until that point never seen her do.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, this must be serious. And she was like crying, like crying, crying, not
Right.
like a tear, but like,
Like bawling.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then she said that my father essentially had been like, stalking her
Mm.
and had threatened her, and that, we were, at least she was in danger, which meant we were in danger. And that's a
Wow.
really like complicated thing for a kid to try to square in your head. Cause like at the end of the day, like I still loved my father.
Yeah, it's such a confusing message, right? Because that's your parent. Even whatever circumstance you can't be with him, at the end of the day, every kid, every child knows they can say, like, my mom loves me, my dad loves me, or, these are my people, these are my parents, right?
Mhm.
You don't expect them to be the one doing the thing that's going to put you in danger. It's your mom or dad. Even if you're questioning how much do they love me, or they're treating me unfairly or whatever, there's still some semblance of safety, and feeling you're not going to be placed in danger as far as your parents are concerned, right?
Mhm.
And so that must have been really confusing.
Extremely. And what happened at that point was my mom said that she had to essentially we had to leave and move. And again, we were living in public housing at that time, so in
Hmm.
order to move, it wasn't like we just save money and like we leave. We didn't have money, so we had to apply for a transfer to another unit somewhere else.
Hmm.
And it was an emergency situation, but in order for us to put that transfer through, we needed a reference from law enforcement. That was one requirement. Another
Mm.
requirement was my mom had to stay in a shelter for 2 weeks. So she literally stayed in the shelter by herself while the kids were at home. We ended up moving across the city, and then immediately all of my friends were gone. When you grow up in a place, you know everybody.
Yeah,
You,
there's everything is familiar to you,
yeah,
and that
exactly.
familiarity was gone. It's one thing to switch schools and have to take a bus to a different neighborhood, But when you uproot and move to a completely different space, you don't have your bearings,
That's it. You know, it's like I
right?
knew where to go for the good pizza in the neighborhood,
Right.
right?
Pizza is important,
You
right?
know, right? It's like you know, like the bus numbers, like where they go, where
Right.
they take you, like
Yeah.
all these like little things you don't think about.
Yeah.
You just know. You know the old guy who doesn't like kids, so you stay away from him.
Yeah, you know who to stay away from, where what is. It's just all of that familiarity, and you don't have that in a new space. There's a lot of exploring and investigating and sort of having to have a curious mind and wandering around to figure some of those things out.
I imagine that to my friends, one day I just disappeared out of thin air, right? Because not
Right.
like back then there wasn't social media
No.
or like cell phones or anything. So like one day I was living there and the next day I was gone, and like I only told one person that I was moving. Like I couldn't bring myself to tell anybody else because
Mm-hmm.
I felt like then I had to explain the situation. Hey, Asante, why are you moving? It's like,
Mm.
well, because my father is threatening my mom and she's in danger and we have to move. Like,
Right.
you know, you're 13, you don't say that to your friends. And I felt very ashamed of that too. I felt ashamed that I couldn't find the courage to tell them what was going on. So anyway, yeah, move across the city. It's 2 weeks
Mm-hmm.
before grade nine's about to begin, and it's a much different area. Like both areas were bad, but in different ways, you know. But when it's a bad area that you grew up in, you know how to navigate it.
Yeah, you can navigate through the fog, right? But if it's new, you don't even know where to begin.
Yeah, you don't know who the safe people are and who the
Yeah.
dangerous people are. You know,
Yeah. There's no
like
semblance of safety in a new community like that.
exactly. And I had like 2 weeks to adjust before I started high school, and it was really tough, you know. And so when we moved, I pretty much just stayed in the house all the time, and my brothers were like, "Hey, you need to go outside and meet people." I'm like, "Dude, it's not that easy." You know, my brothers are 1 year apart, so you all could
They
have
had
gone
each
out
other.
together.
Yeah, they had each other.
When grade nine started,
Hmm.
I was still, you know, I spent the first 2 weeks busing across the city to another all white high school. Just wasn't feeling the vibe, and I pretty much quit after 2 weeks and ended up going to the local school, which ironically enough was like the school for misfits. Like literally all the kids there were there because well they lived close in the neighborhood I lived in, which like not for nothing just didn't produce, like there it was so marginalized, a lot of the kids
Hmm.
just were struggling. But
Hmm.
otherwise, the other kids who went to that school were kids who, for whatever reason, could not succeed anywhere
Hmm.
else. This was like the last resort stop before juvenile detention.
Hmm.
Like this was it. All the kids there are problems, but that was cool for me because I'm like I got problems too. You know, let's talk about it.
Right.
So grade nine actually went really well. You know, yeah, the group that I became friends with, yeah, we were all knuckleheads. Well, I was less of a knucklehead, but they were
But there was
certainly
more
not.
like relatability with the culture and with understanding privilege and not having privilege and resource. And there must have been more of the unspoken truths that you would have gotten with each other that you might not have gotten in your other school communities.
And that's it. And you know what was really interesting about that friend group is like we were all very different. You know, we
Hmm.
were different in race and culture. We were different in terms of like family history,
Yeah.
but we all had,
A way to relate to each other.
yeah, because all of our lives were kind of messed up.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Right.
Right. So, you know, in that way, you know, grade nine was actually rather comfortable for me. But then, you know,
Hmm.
grade nine ended. And
Mm.
actually, the summer grade after grade nine was pretty dope because I started kind of going out with this girl and I was really into her. Like, she wrote poetry. I didn't write poetry, but I like that she liked poetry.
Right.
You know,
Right.
I was like, this makes her mysterious and cool, right?
Mm.
Right.
Hmm.
And so we're doing our thing, and then you know, it felt like I was actually kind of starting to find myself as a young person. And then one day, you know, my brothers and I were watching Euro Cup soccer, and then you know, the crisis line shows up at the house, and they're looking for my mom, and we go upstairs. My mom's on the floor. She's saying she doesn't want to live. Pills are scattered all over the place. You know, my middle brother, like the super machismo guy in the family, like
Right.
he like breaks down completely. He's just like bawling in the bathroom. Uh,
Wow.
you know, my oldest brother is trying to hold it all together for everybody. Me, you know, there's like the fight, flight, freeze thing.
Yep.
Like I go
Yep.
into freeze mode, just
Yep.
like I'm like
Well,
a
it's
statue. I don't know what's going on.
yeah. Well, freeze, that's what the freeze mode is in the threat system, right? So it's The idea is, especially if you're a kid, is that, well, if I just freeze and I play dead, right, it'll just go away.
Yeah, there was a part of me that was like, when am I going to wake up? Right? But then I don't. And then next thing you know, I'm at the hospital and my mom is getting checked out by medical professionals and they give her a prescription
Mm-hmm.
and we're like, oh, she's got the pills now that's gonna make her mind right. We're good. Obviously, it didn't work out that way.
Right.
um, so yeah, I go back to school in grade 10. Well, here's the ramifications. Once that happened, I pretty much withdrew from life. That girl that we kind of had like a little thing starting to develop. I
Right.
just pretty much stopped hanging out with her, calling her. It was
Mm-hmm.
just I disappeared. This was obviously a theme for me, and
Right.
uh, the grade 10 started. That entire friend group I made in grade 9, everybody had dropped out, literally every single person. Like there was nobody left.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm starting from scratch socially again for like the third time in 3 years. My mom was not improving, her mental health was deteriorating.
Right.
It was a bad situation. uh, my
There were
only
a lot of
sanction.
layers. There were so many layers involved, right?
Right? Yeah, and I also live in like a dangerous neighborhood, like where people are getting shot. Like it was
Right.
like there's
There's
so
a
much
lot of
going
things
on.
to be worried about, a lot of things to be aware of and careful for, and then so many concerns in the home, and so many of your own layers of just trying to understand the world and your position in it. It just seems like a lot of tumult.
So much
Yeah.
tumult, and I had no support, right? Because I don't have a lot of family in this country. Most of my family is back home in Jamaica,
Mm-hmm.
or in the United States, or in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of the family that I have in Canada is my father's side, but of course I was split from my father's side of the family.
Right.
And there was nobody on my mom's side, and my mom was barely present because her mental health was deteriorating. My
Right.
oldest brother was living in a different city for school.
Mm-hmm.
My middle brother was, a young adult, and he was working, and he was working the night shift for the most part. So he was either sleeping during the day, or I just didn't see him in the evening.
Right.
So it was just really hard, man. I was by myself all the time, trying to figure out a hostile world with no one to help guide me through it.
Right.
So
No, it's so difficult. It's so difficult when there's so much going on and your brain is not fully developed. Like you're a
yeah,
teenager, you're or just preteen and teen, and you have so much more growth and development, and yet you've been exposed to so much stress and so much intensity, right?
yeah, and you don't know what's going on. Like like the the, the
Yeah,
reason you
you don't
need
comprehend
parents.
it. You don't always understand what's happening, and that's the point of having parents, right? Is
Exactly.
right? That the whole point of having parents, part of parents, the role of a parent is to help you make sense of the world.
And not only did I have that as a lack, but
Mm-hmm.
what I also had was just frequent instability. you know
Mm,
like, just it felt like something extremely jarring and tragic was happening at least once a year,
right.
because it was right.
Yeah.
Grade 6, I didn't see my father. Grade
Mm-hmm.
7, I go to this new school, and it was just a mess because I'm the only black kid in the school almost. Grade 8, my father threatens to hurt my mom, and
Right.
it's like throwing like bricks through her car window.
Oh
Like
my, that's a
serious
lot.
stuff. And then I have to move across the city. Grade 9,
Mm-hmm.
I must make some friends. Grade 10, they're all gone. My mom has a nervous breakdown. Like, so much instability.
Right. Yeah, and the toll of that instability and the lack of response from people and not having the supports that you really needed to feel nurtured and just being in survival mode all those
All the time.
all those times, right? It definitely takes a toll and it becomes insurmountable.
Well, no
And
wonder I had severe anxiety. you
no
know
wonder. Right. So let's segue into that because I'm curious about anything that you'd like to share or feel comfortable sharing about how your mental health specifically was impacted during this
oh,
time.
it was awful. it was
Mm-hmm.
terrible.
Mm-hmm.
I went from being a rather happy-go-lucky kid to just being somber. And the word people used to describe me all the time back then was stoic, because I was always like flat affect, like no expression,
Right.
didn't laugh very much, didn't smile very much. Just I was kind of a zombie moving through the world.
Were you questioning your self-worth while
all the time,
zombieing? Yeah,
all the time, because
right.
it became a situation where I had no friends now. So
Yeah,
like that was also hard.
yeah.
And it's like, am I a loser? Like, how come I don't have friends? Like, what's wrong with me
Mm.
that I don't have any friends?
Questioning yourself.
Right? And then, what's wrong with my family that like all of this is happening? Am I
Yeah,
cursed like by some
yeah.
malicious, malevolent entity? Like,
Right.
why does all this bad stuff keep happening?
Like we can't catch a break.
Could not catch a break.
Yeah.
And my mom's just getting worse by the end of grade 10. It was interesting during grade 10, 3 or 4 times I came home from school and like my mom was just like not there because she was
Mm-hmm.
in the hospital. There was
Mm-hmm.
another emergency, suicidal. She had to go to the hospital. There was
Right.
a time where she went to the hospital and she was there for, I don't know, a little while. And the pills that she was going to use were just like scattered on her bed, and the door was left open.
Mm.
And between me and my brother, none of us closed that door or cleaned up the pills for the entirety of the time that she was away. Like we just couldn't bear to look at it
Right.
and
It's just too much.
acknowledge, yeah, that this is what was happening in our
Yeah.
lives. It was really bad in grade 10. I stopped going outside. I stopped talking to people. I had tremendous social anxiety. I had agoraphobia to the extent that I would sit in front of the doorway and could not get past my anxiety to go outside my house. I would literally just like sit in front of the doorway, and the closer I got to exiting, the more panic I would feel.
Right. And just for the sake of the listeners, just for people to understand what agoraphobia is, it's an anxiety disorder and it has a lot to do with social situations, right? Where you perceive the environment to be unsafe and you won't be able to escape. So it's better to just stay indoors and hide inside, right?
Well, it makes sense I would feel that way because
Mm-hmm.
look at my life, you know what I mean? But
Right.
at the time, I didn't have
Yeah.
anyone to explain that to me. I
No,
hadn't come to that realization. It was just, what
no.
the
That was just
hell
what you were
is
experiencing. We've just put a name to it now, right?
exactly, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
anyway, summer after grade 10, my mom is just completely out of it. I don't like to use this word in a pejorative way, but my mom was kind of, what people would call crazy
Mm-hmm.
uh, at that point in time. She was seeing things that weren't there, believing things that weren't real, hearing things that weren't true.
So
Um,
there was like some hallucinations happening,
Oh, all the time. It was like
right?
pretty much all day, every day. I was getting yelled at because I didn't believe the things that were in her head, the delusions.
Right. And you
I
didn't know
was,
how to handle a person who's having delusions and hallucinations. Like, I mean,
yeah,
a trained professional knows to agree with certain things and allow the person to have their process. But you're just like, I don't know what you're seeing. I
I'm
can't.
15 years old. What am I supposed
Yeah,
to do?
yeah. I don't know this. Like, I don't see what you're seeing. Like, no, it's not happening. And then, of course, you're not going to know how to handle that situation.
Yeah, my mom was deteriorating. My brothers and I were seeing her just get
Mm-hmm.
skinnier and skinnier. Like at this point, it wasn't even her mental health we were worried about. It was her physical health because she was getting so skinny that you could see all the bones in her chest. You could see her heart beating.
Right,
Like she was so skinny.
right.
And so we decided that we had to call the authorities. We, woke up the next day, did that. They saw my mom in not a good way,
Mm-hmm.
immediately like strapped her down to I've never seen paramedics work this fast in my life. Like they were scared, which like is alarming. Anyway, they take my mom to the hospital. She finally gets a super extended stay. They sedate her. When she was sedated, she ended up sleeping for 2 weeks straight because she had been missing so much sleep that she needed that much sleep to catch up. And it wasn't like they sedated her for 2 weeks. They sedated her to put her down, and she just
Yeah.
stayed
It's
down
like
for
an
2 weeks.
induced psychosis that sometimes I don't know if that's what your mom went through, but it's similar to what I have seen in my previous types of work settings, where people will have induced psychosis from like sleep deprivation
Yeah.
or a change in their medication or a trigger from something, and it's not a permanent state, but it's one that's quite intense and really hard to contain, and so.
And it
Um,
just feeds into itself, right?
Yes, right. And it just feeds in and it gets bigger and bigger. But a lot of people do when they get to hospital and they sleep it off for 2 weeks.
Yeah, and well, she needed that, and
Yeah.
then after that, it took her another 2 weeks to be able to eat solid food again
Yeah.
because again,
Rehabilitate
she
that whole process. Yeah.
like
It's all a process, step by step.
And yeah, she wasn't eating. She was 85 pounds when she got to the hospital. And my mom, she's 5'10", right? So really sick.
Right.
And this all happened right before grade 11 was gonna start. So like
My
grade 11
goodness.
started with my mom in the hospital. So 2 to 3 months. It was a while.
Mm-hmm.
Um, again, just alone all the time. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
that's like the
just
big theme, right? Is that you were so alone.
I'm still trying to figure it out socially as a kid. I didn't really do a great job, but I was kind of trying.
Mm-hmm.
Um, fast forward a bit, my mom came out of the hospital. She started to get a little bit better, so I'm like, okay, what about me? What about my life now? And I just realized I wasn't doing very well at all. I was just in a bad place, and it took me an extra year to finish high school. I started university. I started doing some real like knucklehead stuff in university because at that point I was so depressed. I kind of lost any self worth
Mm-hmm.
that I had, and so it didn't. I didn't care about risking my future.
That momentum was gone.
Thinking about the title from prodigy to late bloomer. Well, I
Uh-huh.
hadn't bloomed yet at that point, so I was just a prodigy who amounted to nothing at that
Right.
point in my life. So
Right.
it was hard to look back on childhood me and be like, wow, I had so much potential. Everybody believed in me,
Mm-hmm.
and here I am scraping by, just not living life the right way, just being around the wrong people, having the wrong friends, people who get in trouble, in and out of trouble all the time. And these were the people I liked, and I liked them because they were just as messed up as I was.
Right. You could relate to each other in that way.
Yeah, you know what I
and
mean? And
and so much of your life was that sort of secret from the others, so it was nice when people could relate.
I just felt so ashamed of myself. I had so much shame
So
because
much shame.
I did not live up to expectations.
Yeah, that must have been such a hard one.
They weren't unrealistic expectations. Like, I knew that I had the ability to meet and exceed the expectations people laid out for me when I was a kid. Just everything
Yeah.
was so easy for me. Like, I just knew I could do it. There was never a thing that I tried where I was like, oh, maybe I might fail at this. It was like, well, I'm going to try this thing. I'm going to be good at it. Like everything I did. And
Yes,
I
but
mean,
then
not
there's that
immediately, but
threshold of circumstance, right?
exactly.
And your circumstances, there's just a multitude of them, one after the other.
But no one explains that to you when you're young. You just feel like
No.
you suck. It's like,
No.
it's not like life sucked or your environment sucked or random things happened that,
Mm-hmm.
interrupted your path. It was just, I suck and I'm the reason things aren't working now.
Right. So I mean that makes sense when you tell me that, yeah, I was experiencing a lot, my self-worth was very much compromised, and there was definitely lots of anxiety there, and lots of low self-esteem, and it definitely sounds like if you were not experiencing depression, you were definitely having symptoms that were very depressing and symptoms that were showing up, and the situation itself was depressing.
I was definitely experiencing depression. Like
Right.
I was
Yeah.
like miserable every day, like
Mm-hmm.
no motivation to do anything. It was really bad. I was suicidal, on and off. I would get on the train and I just start crying like in public, you
And so
know?
so I'm curious, how there was clearly a switch, right? So, I mean, I know that with the depression, did you have some sort of an outlet that gave you a way to have a cathartic release from time to time?
Yeah, for me that was music.
Yeah.
Music and, to a lesser extent, basketball.
And so with music, as in listening to music, or was it?
Well, it started as listening to music, but
Hmm.
I grew up with hip hop, right? And
Right.
I was actually very interested in music since I was young. I remember me and
Hmm.
my friend at like 6 years old watching Boys to Men videos and be like, let's write a song, you know what I mean?
Right.
And then we realized we couldn't sing at all. And we couldn't afford an instrument, so the
Right.
only thing left was, well, I'll be a rapper.
Right.
But back then, like, to be a rapper, you need to have like street credibility and like all that. I'm not in the streets like that. Like, I'm
Yeah.
this kind of like nerdy kid who just lives in the projects, but I'm not like running the streets.
So you were writing lyrics? Were you writing like
Yeah,
lyrics,
tremendously,
and then that
like
was your outlet?
voraciously. I still
Right.
have all those notebooks.
Really? That's
Yeah,
exciting. it would be exciting to see, like, all the transformation and change. If you have it documented, like you have notes. You know how we talked about at the beginning when we talked about art and storytelling as an art, and
Hmm.
it's abstract and it tells a story. You don't have to explain it. It shouldn't have to be explained. I feel like lyrics also do that,
Yeah.
especially with when you have a beat that is associated with it too. Like it just brings that vibe.
And that's what it was for me. Like, even if nobody was listening, I was
Hmm.
telling my story to the universe. I was getting it out,
Yes, the universe.
you know? So I was writing voraciously. That's how I processed my anger,
Hmm.
especially my anger toward
Hmm.
my father, which
Hmm.
at that point, I like literally hated him.
Hmm.
Like, a lot of people I don't think know what hate feels like. I know what it feels like
Right.
because I thought he was the reason all of this was happening. Because in my
Mm.
mind, he was the reason my parents split to begin with. He was the one who broke all the promises to me growing up and then just
Hmm.
didn't show up for me. He was the one
Hmm.
who threatened my mom. Like, so
Hmm.
for me, it was just him that created all of this.
Right. And then, of everything that your mom disclosed about the stalking and the threatening, so you guys had to pick up and uproot and move, and even uprooting and moving was a challenge too,
Everything was his
right?
fault in my mind, right?
Right.
Well, the other thing I was doing, I was consuming stories at like an all time rate. I was reading a lot. I was watching a ton of movies. I didn't have nothing to
Okay.
do. I wasn't going out to like
So
chill with my
music,
friends.
basketball,
Yeah,
reading, books.
all of it, all the time.
Right. Just curious. Was there at any point that you spoke to a professional, or did you feel like that was not a good idea?
I wanted to and I didn't want to at the same time.
What was coming up for you? Especially when you're saying, like, you were wavering between, I know I need to get help. I don't want to get help.
Well, I was ashamed of my story and who I was.
Right.
So I didn't want to tell anybody, but I knew that
Okay.
I wasn't okay.
So the shame really became an obstacle.
It was the biggest thing.
And then what about, were you ever wondering if like a therapist would actually be helpful to you, or did you feel like, well, what's the point of that, or did you ever wonder if maybe it wasn't going to be a good idea for you?
I felt like, what's the point of that? And not because I didn't believe in therapy,
Right.
it was because my problems they weren't just like in my head. It was like I was very poor. Like, you know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Mhm.
Like, my mom was experiencing severe health issues.
Yeah.
My like all these things were very tangible things. So in my head at that time, I'm like, I can go talk to a therapist and feel good for 45 minutes to an hour and still go home to blood stain on the concrete and yellow tape around the townhouses.
Right, like how
Like,
would it make a difference? Was that the kind of question you'd be asking yourself?
Exactly. So I mean,
Okay.
there was a couple times where I did have an appointment. One time I signed up for an appointment. They're like, "Well, we'll call you back in a few months because the wait list." By the time they called me back, I just actually had like a good day that day. I'm like, "No, I'm good. Don't worry about it." Then
Right.
another time, I actually ended up in an office, and this was, my mom was starting to turn it around a bit here toward the end of my high school years,
Mhm.
and she accompanied me. And you always fill out that survey at the beginning,
Mhm.
essentially all of your symptoms, and like
Mhm.
there, there are a lot of boxes on that.
Yeah, there's some screening tools that
Yeah,
that they may ask you with.
and I checked almost all of them.
Right.
Like, it was really bad. And
Yeah.
then I met with a therapist, and I looked at this guy, and I'm like, this dude is not going to be able to relate to me and my story. Like, he was kind of like mid 30s, early 40s, you know,
Mhm.
like kind of hipster white guy kind of thing. It's like, this dude's not gonna get me.
So how is this person supposed to relate to me? How are they supposed to relate to the fact that we're going through poverty, that there's issues of racism, and
Exactly.
all of the other aspects that you've already been struggling with? Were you thinking like, well, how is he going to be able to help with that? I don't know how to connect with him.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, he seemed like a super nice guy,
Right.
like
Yeah.
super nice
Yeah.
dude.
Yeah.
But it just, I looked at this guy. I'm like, this guy has no edge. like
Right.
like
Right.
everything I come from is just edges everywhere. Like,
Yes.
edge, chip on my
Yeah.
shoulder. I wasn't the guy to start trouble, but I was waiting for it to arrive. You
Yeah.
know, like, I was
Yeah.
not in a good place.
Right.
Like, this dude, like, he has no edge. Like, he's not gonna get my life. So again,
Mm.
turned it down. But luckily for me, My mom continued to improve over the years, and by the time I was in my early 20s, she was lucid enough to notice I was like not doing well. She, I'll say, strongly encouraged
Mm-hmm.
me to, to talk to our family doctor about it. And
Mm-hmm.
our family doctor, he was cool. He had some edge. I liked him.
Yeah.
And anyway, I told him what had been going on. He wrote a referral to
Yeah.
see a therapist, and a few weeks later, I'm in the therapist's office again. White woman, but she had like the most edge of anybody I'd talked to up until this point, and that was really attractive to me. I was like, here's someone who I can be real with,
Right.
and I was, and and she was kind of like a no nonsense person. Like she knew when I was kind of feeding her BS, and she'll call me out on it and be like, no, what, like, tell me what's really real.
Yeah.
And that was good to, one, disarm me, but two, that was the way to break through. And the work that we did together was completely life changing. And this is where the late blooming is starting to happen.
Right.
Because at that point I was like 22, 23 years old, and like just not in a good place socially,
Right.
financially, any in any kind of way. I was just really behind. They say there's chronological age and like developmental age.
Right.
I missed all of my formative years from like age 15 to age like 21.
Yeah.
I just like missed that period of development. So I was
Yeah.
so
It
far
wasn't in
behind.
alignment, so it felt disjointed probably too, right? Because you're this older person in this older person's body, and there's some parts missing from how you're comprehending the world and
It
making
felt
sense of it.
like, yeah, it felt like everybody else was speaking a different language that I didn't understand.
Right.
And I could never understand it no matter how hard I tried.
When people come to see me in the therapy room, well, I guess now virtually in the virtual therapy room, but people are typically in like one of three places, right? So sometimes when people come to see me and they know, they have a presenting issue or a big part of their story that they're working on, they're getting started. So they need some grounding. They need to figure out how to get their bearings, or they're in the thick of it. They're really in the middle, trying to navigate, figure it out. Or maybe they're looking back where they're trying to have closure or close up loose ends or create new meaning so that they can then move forward in the new space of what they're creating for themselves. So, for yourself, would you say, in terms of the journey that you're on or have been on, would you say that you're looking back in the middle or getting started?
I would say all three at the same time.
All three
And
at the same time.
yeah, and in the sense that I'm at the end of the horrible, miserable part of my journey.
Mm-hmm.
I'm at the beginning of the rocket ship about to take off,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm, you know, approaching the middle of my life,
Oh,
like
okay.
chronologically.
Okay. That's a way to
So
put it.
it feels like I'm in all of those positions all at the same time.
Okay.
And I also feel extremely grateful to be where I am today, because I was a late bloomer, but at least I bloomed,
Yeah, you did
right?
bloom. I'm curious about what your key message or messages are to the listeners of our show.
My key messages, I think a couple things.
Mm-hmm.
Never give up is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
All pain is temporary. And
Yeah.
yeah, I would say those are the two things, because for me to be in the position I am, here we are talking, right? All of a sudden, I have great relationships, great friends, a lovely
Mm-hmm.
wife, beautiful
Mm-hmm.
kid, um, a great career. Everything is starting to coalesce in
Mm-hmm.
the most beautiful of ways.
Yes.
And I was late, but here I am blooming.
So I'm curious about what is your game-changing inspiration that reflects your untold story. So would there be like a quote or a mantra, a book, an event or a person, anything, something that speaks to you?
There was a book in
Mm-hmm.
grade 12 called Finding Fish, the autobiography of Antoine Fisher. It was autobiography, right? So it was about African American guy who grew up with every kind of abuse you could imagine, super lonely. A lot of the things that resonated with me. He was this kid who was precocious when he was young, but became the shy, introverted teenager, super insecure, awkward, all the things I was as a teenager, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
I really related to this guy, and then at the end of it, he joined the military, met a mentor. The mentor supported him in so many ways. He discovered himself, and all the trauma and stuff from his past, he was able to process and work through. And then, he met a beautiful woman, settled down, had a family, had a regular life and a career, and just everything worked out for him in the end by the time he hit age 30. And for me, it said, if this dude can do it and come from even more instability, and he dealt with way
Right.
more abuse than
Right.
cause I didn't really deal with abuse, right? It was just like
No.
nobody was around.
Right.
He just dealt with so much. If he
Right.
could do it, I have no reason to. I must at least try, because
Yeah.
he walked the path already. So there's
Mm-hmm.
a path I know that exists that I could also walk.
Right. What a pivotal moment of clarity,
Yeah,
right?
and completely changed the game for me.
Mm-hmm.
And
You needed the story to choose differently.
this is why stories are so important.
Yes. Yes, they totally are. So tell me, what is a cause or an organization that has been impactful to you on your journey that you would like to give a shout out to?
Well, I want to give a shout out to my mom first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I want to give a shout out to her because despite all of the challenges that she faced, she gave me the first gift I ever had,
Mm-hmm.
and that was teaching me to read when I was like 3 years old. So all of this like precociousness, and he was a prodigy, it really stemmed from I had like a 2 or 3 year head start than
Right.
most other kids in terms of my ability to absorb and synthesize and connect information.
Mm-hmm.
But she was also super resilient and the greatest example of that I've ever seen. So I just couldn't give up, and I had to
Big
keep
shout out
trying.
to
And
your mom. Yeah,
yeah,
big shout out to your mom.
I love that woman to death. I want to shout out an organization I worked at. This was my first like real
Yeah.
job, Pathways to Education,
Okay.
in Toronto, and I really grew up there. I really found myself in that organization. We were all starting out in our like early to mid 20s, all at the same time. There was like 8 of us, so
Right.
like we were all going through like the milestones together.
Right. So, how can people connect with you if they want to connect? How are you findable?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Asante Talks. That's ASANTE Talks.
Okay.
You can also find me on my very new website. I'm still working on it.
Okay.
AsanteTalks.net. And yeah, LinkedIn as well. My real name, no gimmicks,
Uh-huh.
Asante Houghton. And, I'm not a hard person to find.
Amazing. Asante.
Yeah.
So, I know your untold story is actually a told story at this point.
Uh-huh.
Um, However, you just dared yourself to share again. Congrats.
Thank you. Well, we went into some details I never talked about before,
Yeah, there were some
right?
new angles. I kind of sensed maybe there were some new angles, so I was curious to see what was going to unfold. And I'm giving you a virtual high five from over here.
I appreciate that. I'm giving
How?
you one right back.
Thank you. How was the experience for you as you openly shared today?
Oh, it was amazing. I feel there's a catharsis to being
I
able
love
to
it.
tell your story, to be able to talk about it openly and just be real with you.
Yes.
Super liberating. And that shame I was talking about,
Mm-hmm.
it works to dismantle the shame.
Oh, I love hearing that. Shame dismantled. Honestly, Asante, I can't thank you enough for coming on this podcast today, sharing with complete openness and taking risk to continue to stay in your vulnerability. Totally humbled to have this conversation with you today. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. I really appreciated it. And yeah, I'd love to come back.
Please
And
do. And once again, Asante, thank you for being a part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma.
thank you.
To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.